It's said that every explorer knows the risks associated with their chosen life of adventure. In July of 2010, however, 2 Norwegian adventurers would come to realize the true nature of those risks as they attempted to make history in the icy realms of the Arctic. This is the horrifying true story of 23-year-old Sebastian Nilssen and his friend Ludvig Fjeld, the former of which would on one fateful day wake up with his head trapped in the jaws of a polar bear. In late July of 2010, kayaker Sebastian Nilssen and his friend Ludvig Fjeld set out on a quest in an attempt to set a world record by becoming the first team to paddle around Norway's Svalbard archipelago. The island chain, which is located midway between mainland Norway and the North Pole, comprises of 9 main islands and spans over 24,000 square miles, nearly 60% of which is covered in snow. This icy northern wonderland boasts a surreal dramatic wilderness of ice fields and tundras nestled between mountains and glaciers. Svalbard's breathtaking landscape aside, the extreme nature of the expedition would bring the men to the bounds of their grit, and this was in more ways than just one. For instance, average summer temperatures in the area range between 37 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, and to circumnavigate the archipelago, the kayakers would need to traverse around 1,250 miles of frigid waters. Nilssen and Fjeld had spent years planning and training for the 2-month journey, practicing their paddling in Norway's icy fjords and rivers, as well as testing their endurance by swimming in its freezing waters. It's also worth mentioning that Nilssen and Fjeld were cautioned by other Arctic explorers that they'd encountered during their training about just how dangerous polar bears can be. Heeding these warnings, the pair would go on to undertake rifle training, diligently preparing for every scenario. However, little did they know just how crucial this training was, as not long afterward, they would have to apply the skills they'd learned from it in a life-or-death, real-world situation. With its 7 national parks and 29 protected areas, Svalbard is a haven for wildlife, from auks and puffins to seals and reindeer. But as many of you may already know, this icy region also falls within the natural range of the largest and most powerful carnivore on land. The polar bear, aptly dubbed the king of the Arctic, roams these northern islands. Like other apex predators, these creatures sit at the very top of the food chain, where humans are their only threat. However, sometimes the tables can turn, and when they do, the results are the vast majority of the time catastrophic. While polar bears primarily hunt seals, they're also known to take down the occasional walrus and even reindeer from time to time, which is a testament to the sheer strength of this impressive animal. They can weigh up to a whopping 1,800 pounds, and while they are more slender and streamlined than brown bears, they have exceptionally large clawed paws and razor-sharp teeth perfectly adapted for cutting into meat and blubber. They also have 2 layers of fur and a thick layer of fat to insulate them against the freezing Arctic temperatures, making them the ideal pagophilic predator. But there is something else that sets these bears aside from other carnivores and places them amongst the most feared predators on the planet. They're also known as one of the only carnivores on the planet to view humans as food. During their attempt at making history, Nilssen and Fjeld kayaked during the days, averaging about 15 miles per, and would spend their nights camping under the spectacular Norwegian sky. By the end of the month, they'd reached the blistery Nordøslandet, which is one of the northernmost islands in the archipelago. The high winds and rough seas of that particular day would force the pair to retreat to the shore early and set up their camp for the night on a rocky beach. And like every evening, they rigged up an old tripwire perimeter fence roughly 9 feet from their tent, with the purpose of course of scaring off a curious bear and also alerting them if one was around. They even got a chance to test the tripwire when Nilssen would accidentally stumble over it while chasing a tarp, after which he would replace the charge, content in the knowledge that the tripwire worked. The next morning, the duo woke up to even stormier weather, which is when they decided to play it safe and hang back at camp for the day. Miles away, a large male polar bear had been using the winds to track any scents blowing his way. The bear would, unfortunately for Nilssen and Fjeld, pick up their scent, which it likely deemed to be a potential food source, prompting its natural instinct to investigate. That evening, Nilssen and Fjeld lay in their 2-person tent. They had completed their nightly rifle check and made sure they were locked and loaded as they drifted off to sleep to the sounds of howling winds outside. Soon enough, the polar bear would reach the campsite and began investigating the unfamiliar setting. To the misfortune of Nilssen and Fjeld, the bear would then pass through the aforementioned tripwire, but this time, it did not trigger. The bear would then stealthily approach the tent where Nilssen and Fjeld were sound asleep, and with a single swipe of its massive paw, it would easily rip open the tent. A startled Nilssen was then jolted awake and would freeze in horror as he locked eyes with the hungry polar bear. Just as he screamed bear, the polar bear sprang toward him and clamped its jaws around his head. Nilssen could feel the bear's teeth scraping against his skull as it pulled him out of his sleeping bag and proceeded to drag him from the tent. It was then, in a desperate bid to save his own life, that Nilssen was able to reach out and grab his shotgun in the midst of the chaos, while ineffectively, of course, punching the mighty bear in the head with his free hand. The bear would at this point suddenly release his skull and grab Nilssen by the shoulder. It would then vault him into the air like a ragdoll, violently thrashing him back and forth, sinking its teeth deeper and deeper into his flesh to maintain a grip with every jerk of its massive head. The bear then proceeded to drag him along the rocky beach toward the water. And just as Nilssen finally snapped into his senses, realizing he was still holding on to the shotgun, the bear then shook him again, causing him to drop the gun, which the mighty bear then stepped on, snapping it in two as if it were a twig. By now, Nilssen had lost all hope, accepting his fate as what he believed to be his only chance of survival lay in pieces on the ground. But Fjeld, who had woken up to Nilssen's scream in a camp in tatters, had grabbed his rifle that was lodged in the dirt next to the tent and frantically called out for his friend, not knowing if he was too late. It was at this point that the bear had carried Nilssen about 100 feet from the camp, where it would drop him onto the ground, stand over him, and begin raking its claws down his torso. Nilssen could feel his ribs crack as he sunk into the ground under the bear's weight. Suddenly, the bear stopped and would turn to face a trembling Fjeld, who was standing in front of him with his finger on his rifle's trigger. As Fjeld steadied himself, finding his aim, a bloodied Nilssen then screamed and pleaded for his friend to shoot. The determined bear would then make another move. It grabbed Nilssen by the head and stood on its hind legs, lifting him off the ground as he screamed in agony. Fjeld meanwhile looked on in horror, frozen in shock as he realized that he no longer had a clear shot, as Nilssen's blood-soaked body hung in front of the bear. As Fjeld ran toward them to get a better shot, the bear would then drop down on all fours, finally giving him a chance to take a shot, which would pierce through the bear's shoulder, causing it to drop Nilssen to the ground. Fjeld would then fire 4 more shots into the bear's chest, which would finally take down the massive ursine. Fjeld would then immediately reload his rifle before rushing over to his friend's side. A horrified Fjeld would then discover the extent of his friend's injuries. Nilssen's scalp was hanging loose, his shoulder was torn open, and his upper body was covered in deep gashes. But remarkably, he was still alive and conscious. Fjeld then carried him back to the tent, bandaged him as best as he could to stop the bleeding, and wrapped him in a sleeping bag. He would then go on to assure him that he would live. But despite his friend's attempt at giving him hope, Nilssen nevertheless was groaning in pain, and truly felt that this was the end for him. To their good fortune, however, the pair did have one last hope in the form of a satellite phone, which Fjeld would then promptly use to call the hospital in Longyearbyen, managing to keep Nilssen awake and conscious in the 2 hours that it took for a rescue copter to arrive. Nilssen was then flown to the hospital, where he was operated on for almost 3 hours. The doctors would then later tell them that one of the bear's bites to his torso had missed Nilssen's lungs by just 3 millimeters, and had it made contact, it would very likely have killed him. Nilssen and Fjeld would go on to share what was their biggest regret from the incident, which was the fact that they had to kill the bear, and that despite their brutal encounter, they still respect and admire these magnificent beasts of the Arctic. Of course, these days, from as far away as possible. Polar bears have been well documented to be indiscriminate predators and are among the likeliest carnivores to prey on humans, especially when their primary food source is low. Something to note about their habitat is that it's heavily impacted by climate change, resulting in a significantly lowered amount of annual ice, which the bears depend on for hunting along the Arctic coasts. This results in most of the bears ending up having to spend their summers on land, waiting for the waters to freeze again. Meaning, by around the time of late July, the polar bears are extremely hungry, which of course contributed to the likelihood of Nilssen and Fjeld's near-fatal encounter. The year following this incident, there was another polar bear attack in Svalbard that would tragically see the life of a young man be taken in dramatic fashion. This was also known as one of the most brutal polar bear encounters ever recorded, an event that we've covered in a previous episode. You can find it on the end screen of this video.